The Pacific fog rolled thick across Camp Pendleton's main gate as dawn broke over Southern California. Lieutenant Colonel Nadia Chambers gripped the steering wheel of her rental sedan, watching Marines in crisp uniforms process vehicles through the security checkpoint with military precision. She'd deliberately arrived early, so 5:45 hours, 15 minutes before her scheduled meeting with the base commander, and she'd deliberately dressed down. Nike running jacket, black athletic pants, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No uniform, no rank insignia, no Delta Force unit patch that would announce exactly who she was. This was intentional. A test. In 16 years of Delta Force operations, Nadia had learned that you discovered the truth about an organization not by announcing your arrival with fanfare, but by observing how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Today marked her first day commanding the Joint Special Operations Training Initiative, a historic assignment that would place her, an Army Delta Force operator, in direct command of Marine Force recon units. The Pentagon had chosen her specifically for this role, and she knew exactly how controversial that choice was. A black woman. Army, not Marine Corps. Commanding Marines in special operations. She needed to know what she was walking into. The rental sedan rolled forward in the queue. Nadia reached for her military ID and orders packet, setting them on the passenger seat within easy reach. Through the windshield, she could see the gate sentries more clearly now. 3 Marines in digital camouflage, weapons secured but present, eyes scanning each vehicle with the kind of vigilance that came from years of force protection duty. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged not by their credentials or character, but purely by their appearance? If you believe that respect should be earned through service and sacrifice, not assumed based on skin color or gender, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to show you that assumptions in the military can be career-ending. The vehicle ahead of her cleared the checkpoint. Nadia pulled forward, rolling down her window as a young Marine, Lance Corporal based on his rank insignia, approached with a clipboard. He was maybe 22, blonde hair in a high and tight cut, blue eyes that skimmed over her with practiced efficiency. "Morning, ma'am," he said, the courtesy automatic. "ID and base access authorization, please." Nadia handed him her military ID card, the one clearly marked with her rank, branch, and security clearance level. The Marine's eyes dropped to the card, then snapped back to her face, then back to the card. His expression shifted from routine boredom to confusion, then to something that looked like suspicion. "This says Lieutenant Colonel," he said slowly, as if reading words in a foreign language. "That's correct, Corporal." "Army." "Also correct." The young Marine, his name tape read Cooper, held the ID up to the early morning light, tilting it back and forth as if checking for forgery. "Ma'am, is this your ID?" Nadia felt the first flutter of tension in her chest. "Yes, Corporal Cooper. That's my identification. I have orders to report to Colonel Henderson at 600 hours. Hold on." Cooper stepped back from the vehicle, still holding her ID, and turned toward the security booth. "Gunny, need you to see something." From the fortified booth emerged a tall white man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and radiating the kind of confidence that came from 20 years of service. His uniform displayed the rank of gunnery sergeant, along with a chest full of ribbons that spoke to multiple deployments. His name tape identified him as Thornton, and the moment his eyes landed on Nadia's vehicle, or more specifically, on Nadia herself, his expression hardened. Gunnery Sergeant Derek Thornton walked to the driver's side window with the deliberate swagger of a man who owned this checkpoint, who'd decided the fate of thousands of people trying to access this base, who knew with absolute certainty that he had the authority and the right to determine who belonged here. He looked at the ID in Cooper's hand. Then he looked at Nadia. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Thornton said. It wasn't a request. "Gunnery Sergeant, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nadia Chambers, U.S. Army Delta Force. I have orders to—" "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice carried the edge of a man who was accustomed to immediate obedience, whose authority had rarely been questioned by anyone who understood the Marine Corps hierarchy. Nadia's jaw tightened. She could feel this situation beginning to spiral, could sense the assumptions forming in Thornton's mind as clearly as if he'd spoken them aloud. But she was a Delta Force operator. She'd survived firefights in Fallujah, close-quarters combat in Syrian compounds, hostage rescue operations that had left her with a Purple Heart and a Silver Star. She wasn't going to be intimidated by a gate guard having a power trip. "Gunnery Sergeant, if you'll examine my credentials, now." Thornton's hand moved to his service weapon, not drawing it, but letting his palm rest on the grip in an unmistakable threat gesture. "Do not make me repeat myself again." The fog seemed to thicken around the checkpoint. Nadia could see other Marines emerging from the security booth now, a staff sergeant with a phone in his hand, already recording, and a younger corporal who positioned himself at the passenger side of her vehicle. The morning traffic behind her had backed up, other vehicles waiting to access the base, their occupants craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. Slowly, deliberately maintaining control of her movements to avoid any action that could be misinterpreted as aggressive, Nadia opened the driver's door and stepped out onto the asphalt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle," Thornton said, already moving into her personal space with the confidence of someone who'd conducted thousands of security screenings. "Gunnery Sergeant, I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I am assigned to Delta Force, and I have orders to report to your base commander in 10 minutes. My credentials are—" "Your credentials," Thornton interrupted, making air quotes with his free hand while his other remained near his weapon, "are suspicious at best. You show up here in civilian clothes, driving a rental car, claiming to be a Delta Force officer?" He let out a sharp laugh that held no humor. "Lady, I've been doing this job for 5 years. You know how many people try to access this base with fake IDs? How many civilians show up claiming to be someone they're not? I'm not claiming anything. I am— What you are is someone who's about to be detained for attempting to impersonate a military officer." Thornton gestured sharply at Cooper. "Call the MPs. Tell them we've got a possible imposter trying to access the base with forged credentials." Nadia's heart rate accelerated, not from fear, but from the rising fury of a combat veteran who'd earned every single ribbon on her dress uniform being treated like a criminal by a man who'd never faced the kind of operations she ran routinely. "Gunnery Sergeant Thornton, if you contact the base commander's office right now, they will confirm my identity and my orders. I am expected—" "You know what I think?" Thornton stepped closer, close enough that Nadia could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough to violate every professional boundary that should exist between an NCO and a field-grade officer. "I think you're probably somebody's girlfriend who got confused about which building you're supposed to meet them at. Maybe one of the junior enlisted Marines told you to come to the main gate, gave you some story about getting you on base." The accusation landed like a physical blow. The assumption behind it, that a black woman in her late 30s presenting military identification could only be here because she was romantically involved with a service member, revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had plagued Nadia's entire career. "That's not—" she began, but Corporal Cooper interrupted. "Gunny, you want me to check the dependent database? See if she's registered as somebody's spouse or girlfriend?" Cooper's tone carried an eagerness to please his supervisor that made Nadia's stomach turn. "Good thinking, Cooper." Thornton finally pulled Nadia's military ID from where Cooper had been holding it, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Although this is pretty sophisticated for a fake. Whoever made this knew what they were doing. Got the hologram placement right, correct font, even has a chip embedded." "Sir, that's because it's real," Nadia said, her voice rising despite her training to remain calm under pressure. "That is a legitimate Department of Defense Common Access card issued to me, with my rank, my clearance level, and my— Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop talking and place your hands behind your back." Thornton's voice had gone cold, the tone of a man who'd made his decision and would not be swayed by evidence or argument. A staff sergeant emerged from the booth. His name tape read Morrison, with a set of flex cuffs in his hand. He avoided making eye contact with Nadia, but his body language communicated everything about his complicity in what was happening. This wasn't the first time these Marines had decided someone didn't belong based purely on appearance. "This is insane," Nadia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I have served this country for 16 years. I have combat deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. I was awarded the Silver Star for actions under fire in Mosul. I am currently assigned to Delta Force, and I have orders, signed by a 3-star general, to report to Camp Pendleton today to assume command of a joint special operations training initiative. If you detain me, if you restrain me, you will be in violation of—" "You people always have such elaborate stories," Thornton interrupted, his emphasis on "you people" unmistakable in its racial coding. "Always claiming to be someone important. Lawyers, doctors, officers. It's always something impressive, isn't it? Never just 'I'm here to visit' or 'I made a wrong turn.' It's always this grand tale about how successful you are, how many degrees you have, how important your job is." Nadia's vision narrowed. The fog, the checkpoint, the gathering crowd of Marines and other base personnel, all of it receded except for Thornton's face, twisted with the kind of prejudice that no amount of military discipline had managed to erase from his world view. "Check my ID in the system," Nadia said, forcing her voice to remain level. "Right now. Pull up my service record. You'll see—" "What I'll see," Thornton said, moving even closer, "is exactly what I'm seeing right now. A woman who doesn't belong here, who thought she could talk her way onto a Marine Corps base with a fake ID and an attitude. You want to know what's really happening? You're probably running some kind of scam. Identity theft, maybe. Or you bought that ID off the dark web thinking you could use it to access secure facilities. That's ridiculous. Is it?" Thornton's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Because from where I'm standing, it makes a hell of a lot more sense than the idea that Delta Force, would send a—" He paused, his eyes raking over her in a way that made his assessment crystal clear. "Someone like you to command Marines. That's not how the military works, sweetheart. That's not how special operations works. So either you're running a con or you're legitimately confused about your own identity, and either way, you don't get access to this base." Behind Nadia, car horns began honking. The morning traffic jam was backing up onto the highway now, dozens of Marines and civilian contractors late for their duty shifts because of this confrontation. Some had stepped out of their vehicles, phones raised, recording the scene. Nadia could hear voices from the crowd. "What's taking so long? They're arresting someone at the gate. Is that a black woman? What did she do? Probably tried to get on base without proper authorization." The assumptions, the automatic criminalization, the immediate conclusion that she must have done something wrong. It was all so familiar it made Nadia's chest ache with the weight of decades of this same pattern repeating itself over and over. "Gunnery Sergeant Thornton," Nadia said, pulling herself to her full height despite being 7 inches shorter than the Marine in front of her. "I am ordering you to verify my credentials through official channels. Contact the base commander's office. Contact the Pentagon's Joint Special Operations Command. Contact—" "You're not ordering me to do anything," Thornton snarled. "You have no authority here. You have no rank I'm required to recognize. What you have is about 30 seconds to cooperate voluntarily before I have these Marines physically restrain you and call the MPs to haul you off this base in handcuffs." Morrison stepped forward with the flex cuffs, his movements mechanical, as if he'd done this many times before and felt no need to question whether it was appropriate. Cooper moved to Nadia's other side, effectively boxing her in. The 3 Marines formed a wall of uniforms and assumed authority, men who'd spent their entire careers in a system that had taught them exactly who belonged in positions of power and who didn't. And Nadia, decorated combat veteran, Delta Force operator, Silver Star recipient, the woman specifically selected by the Pentagon to break barriers and lead this historic joint command, didn't fit their mental model of who deserved respect. "Last chance," Thornton said. "Hands behind your back, or we do this the hard way." Nadia looked past him toward the security booth where she could see a landline phone on the desk. One call. That's all it would take. One call to Colonel Henderson's office, and this entire situation would resolve itself. But Thornton had no intention of making that call. He'd already decided her guilt, already constructed a narrative in which she was the threat, and he was the hero protecting his base from infiltration. "I am not resisting," Nadia said clearly, making sure her voice carried to all the phones recording this encounter. "I am a commissioned officer and I am complying under protest, but I want it documented that I have repeatedly identified myself, repeatedly requested verification through official channels, and been denied due process." "Save the speech for the MPs," Thornton said, then nodded at Morrison. "Cuff her." The staff sergeant moved behind Nadia, roughly pulling her arms backward with enough force to wrench her shoulders. The flex cuffs bit into her wrists as he cinched them tight, tighter than necessary, tight enough to cut off circulation, tight enough to leave marks that would last for days. "You're making a mistake," Nadia said through gritted teeth as pain shot up her arms. "The only mistake," Thornton replied, "is you thinking you could pull this off. Whatever scam you're running ends here." He reached into the rental car and pulled out Nadia's folder of orders, official Pentagon documents on letterhead signed by Lieutenant General Marcus Crawford, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. Thornton flipped through them with the casual disregard of someone who'd already decided they were fake. "These look real," Cooper said, reading over Thornton's shoulder. "Like really real. The watermarks, the seals—" "Of course they look real," Thornton interrupted. "That's the point of a good forgery. You think someone running a con is going to show up with obviously fake documents?" He tossed the folder back into the car. "Probably paid a few $100s to have these made at some copy shop." "Those are original documents," Nadia said, her voice strained as Morrison's grip on her restrained arms tightened. "Signed by a 3-star general. If you would just call—" "Morrison, take her to the holding room," Thornton ordered. "Cooper, get those MPs here now. And someone get this traffic moving. We've got a base to run." Morrison began walking Nadia toward the security booth, his hand clamped on her upper arm with bruising force. Her shoulders screamed in protest as he pulled her along, the flex cuffs cutting deeper into her wrists with each step. The crowd of onlookers parted, some averting their eyes, others recording more eagerly, capturing every moment of her humiliation. "This is illegal detention," Nadia called out, projecting her voice so everyone could hear. "I am being restrained without cause. I have identified myself as a military officer. I have presented valid credentials, and I am being treated as a criminal because of assumptions based on my race and gender." "Oh, here we go," Thornton said loudly, playing to the crowd. "The race card. Because everything is about race, right? Can't possibly be that you're actually in the wrong here. Can't be that you're trying to illegally access a military installation. No, it has to be racism. It always is with you people." There it was again. You people. The phrase that carried centuries of discrimination in 2 simple words. Morrison shoved Nadia into the security booth's holding room, a windowless concrete box with a metal bench and nothing else. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the dim space with her hands still bound painfully behind her back, her shoulders throbbing, her wrists going numb from the tight restraints. Through the door, she could hear Thornton's voice. "Get a female MP here to process her. And someone run her prints. Let's see who she really is. I'm betting we find warrants, prior arrests, something that explains why she's so desperate to get on this base." Nadia closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe through the pain and the rage. 16 years of service, 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, twice recommended for promotion ahead of her peers, selected by the Pentagon for one of the most sensitive command assignments in the special operations community, and she couldn't get past a gate guard who'd decided she was a criminal the moment he saw her black face. The minutes crawled past. 5, 10, 15. Through the walls, Nadia could hear radio chatter, phones ringing, Thornton's voice giving orders about processing the imposter they'd detained. No one was calling the base commander's office. No one was verifying her story. They'd all decided her guilt instantaneously, and now they were simply going through the motions of official procedure to justify their prejudice. At 23 minutes past the hour, 23 minutes after she should have been sitting in Colonel Henderson's office beginning her first day of command, Nadia heard a commotion outside the holding room. A man's voice, sharp with authority. "Where is she? Where is Lieutenant Colonel Chambers?" The door burst open. Major Richard Sullivan stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and exertion as if he'd run from the command building. His eyes landed on Nadia, hands bound behind her back, shoulders twisted in pain, leaning against the concrete wall of the holding cell, and his expression transformed into absolute horror. Sullivan snapped to attention so rigidly that Nadia heard his heels click together. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Chambers, ma'am." His hand flew to his forehead in a crisp salute that, under the circumstances, was physically impossible for Nadia to return. Behind Sullivan, Gunnery Sergeant Thornton appeared in the doorway, confusion spreading across his face like cracks in ice. "Major, sir, this woman is—" "This woman," Sullivan interrupted, his voice vibrating with barely controlled fury, "is Lieutenant Colonel Nadia Chambers, U.S. Army Delta Force, Silver Star recipient, and as of 600 hours this morning, the commanding officer of the Joint Special Operations Training Initiative. Which means, Gunnery Sergeant, she outranks everyone on this base except the base commander herself. And you have her in handcuffs?" The color drained from Thornton's face. The silence in the security booth stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then chaos erupted. "Get those restraints off her right now!" Sullivan roared, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that made every Marine in the vicinity snap to immediate action. Morrison fumbled with a knife to cut the flex cuffs, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it twice. The moment the plastic restraints fell away, blood rushed back into Nadia's hands with painful intensity. She brought her arms forward slowly, her shoulders screaming in protest after being wrenched backward for nearly 30 minutes. Purple marks encircled both wrists where the cuffs had cut into her skin. Sullivan's eyes locked on those marks, and his jaw clenched so tight that Nadia could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Gunnery Sergeant Thornton, you are to remain at this post. Do not move. Do not speak to anyone. Do not attempt to leave this base. Is that understood?" "Sir, Thornton's voice had lost all its earlier confidence, replaced by the trembling realization of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. "I asked if that was understood, Gunnery Sergeant." "Yes, sir. Understood, sir." Sullivan turned back to Nadia, his expression shifting from rage to deep concern. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Nadia rolled her shoulders carefully, testing the damage. Everything hurt, but nothing felt permanently damaged. She'd endured worse in combat. Far worse. But this pain carried a different weight. This wasn't the honorable wound of battle. This was the degradation of being treated as less than human by people who should have recognized her authority, her service, her sacrifice. "I'm fine, Major," she said, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. "But I want every detail of this incident documented. Security footage, witness statements, radio communications, everything." "Already in progress, ma'am. When you didn't arrive at Colonel Henderson's office by 0610, she sent me to locate you. I was tracking your vehicle's entry into the base perimeter when I discovered you'd been detained at the gate." Sullivan's expression darkened. "The base commander is en route now. And ma'am, she is extremely displeased." That was putting it mildly, Nadia suspected. Patricia Henderson had personally recruited her for this assignment, had fought the Pentagon bureaucracy for 6 months to get approval for an Army officer to command Marines in special operations training. Henderson had staked her reputation on Nadia's selection. And now, on Nadia's first day, her own gate security had treated her like a criminal. The sound of a vehicle approaching at high speed cut through the morning air. A black SUV with command flags mounted on the hood skidded to a stop in front of the security booth. The door flew open before the vehicle fully stopped, and Colonel Patricia Henderson emerged like a storm given human form. Henderson was 52 years old, 5 feet 11 inches of lean muscle and iron discipline, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that could strip paint at 50 yards. She'd been the first woman to command a Marine Expeditionary Unit in combat, and she radiated the kind of authority that made grown men instinctively stand straighter in her presence. Every Marine at the gate snapped to attention as she approached. Henderson's gaze swept over the scene. Nadia rubbing her wrists, the cut flex cuffs on the ground, Sullivan's protective positioning between Nadia and the gate security team, and Thornton's face rapidly cycling through shades of white and gray. "Somebody," Henderson said in a voice of deadly calm, "had better start explaining why my incoming Joint Task Force commander was detained like a common criminal at my front gate." No one spoke. The fog had burned off completely now, leaving the checkpoint exposed in harsh morning sunlight that made every detail of the situation painfully clear. Henderson turned to Nadia. "Colonel Chambers, are you injured?" "Restrained with excessive force, Colonel. Shoulders strained, wrists abraded, but functional." Nadia kept her report clinical, professional, letting the facts speak for themselves. "I see." Henderson's tone could have frozen the Pacific Ocean. She pivoted to face Thornton. "Gunnery Sergeant, you will explain in complete detail your actions this morning." Thornton swallowed hard. "Ma'am, she arrived in civilian clothes, driving a rental vehicle. She presented identification that claimed she was a lieutenant colonel, but given the circumstances, it seemed suspicious." "Circumstances." Henderson repeated the word like she was examining a biological specimen. "Elaborate on these circumstances, Gunnery Sergeant." "Ma'am, Thornton's eyes darted to Nadia, then away, unable to maintain contact. "She didn't look like what I expected for an officer of that rank." "Did you scan her military ID in the verification system?" A pause. "No, ma'am." "Did you contact my office to verify her expected arrival?" "No, ma'am." "Did you examine the orders she was carrying, which I personally signed and which clearly identified her as an incoming commander?" I believed they might be forged, ma'am." Henderson stepped closer to Thornton, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "Gunnery Sergeant, I have reviewed the security footage from this checkpoint. I have listened to the audio recording. I have read witness statements from 7 Marines and 4 civilian contractors who observed your conduct. So I'm going to ask you directly. Why did you assume Colonel Chambers' credentials were fraudulent?" The question hung in the air like an axe waiting to fall. "Ma'am, in my experience..." "Your experience told you that a black woman in athletic wear couldn't possibly be a Delta Force lieutenant colonel?" Henderson's voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made her words more devastating than if she'd been shouting. "Your experience told you to ignore official DoD identification, Pentagon-issued orders, and direct statements from a superior officer? Your experience told you to physically restrain a field-grade officer and hold her in a detention cell?" "I was following security protocols." "You were following prejudice." Henderson's control finally cracked, her voice rising to a parade ground volume that made several Marines flinch. "You took one look at Colonel Chambers and decided she didn't belong here, not because of any actual security concern, not because of any legitimate protocol violation, but because she didn't match your mental image of what a high-ranking officer should look like. Is that accurate?" Thornton's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "I'll take that as confirmation." Henderson turned to Sullivan. "Major, place Gunnery Sergeant Thornton under arrest. Charges to include violation of Article 92, failure to obey lawful orders from a superior officer, and Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment of subordinates. Add Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Confine him to the brig pending court-martial. Ma'am, wait. Thornton's composure finally shattered completely. Please, I have 20 years of service. I'm 3 years from retirement. My pension— Should have thought of that before you decided your personal biases were more important than military regulations. Henderson's expression held no sympathy. Staff Sergeant Morrison, Corporal Cooper, Lance Corporal Hayes, you three are also under investigation for your roles in this incident. You are relieved of gate security duties effective immediately and confined to base pending the outcome of the investigation. Morrison had gone pale. Colonel, we were following the gunnery sergeant's orders. You were participating in the unlawful detention of a superior officer. Each of you had opportunities to question those orders, to verify Colonel Chambers' identity through proper channels, to exercise the judgment that Marines are supposed to possess. You chose not to. You will face the consequences. Henderson pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. I'm contacting NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, to take over this case. This isn't just a military discipline issue. This is a potential federal civil rights violation. Colonel Chambers, you have every right to press charges in civilian court as well as pursuing military justice. Nadia nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. She'd wanted to understand what she was walking into when she took this command. Now she knew. The question was, how deep did this problem run? Colonel Henderson, Nadia said carefully, I'd like to review security footage from this gate for the past 6 months. I want to see if there's a pattern. Henderson's eyes narrowed with understanding. You think this isn't an isolated incident? I think Gunnery Sergeant Thornton's confidence in his actions suggests he's done this before without consequences. I think his subordinates followed his lead without question because they've been trained, formally or informally, that this behavior is acceptable. And I think if we dig deeper, we'll find other victims who didn't have the rank or resources to fight back. Agreed. Henderson gestured toward her SUV. We'll review the footage from my office. Major Sullivan, coordinate with the MPs to process these arrests. I want everything documented with excruciating detail. Every word spoken, every action taken, every piece of evidence preserved. When this goes to court-martial, I want the case to be absolutely airtight. As Sullivan moved to execute his orders, Nadia walked toward Henderson's vehicle, passing close to where Thornton stood with MPs now flanking him. The gunnery sergeant's face had settled into a mask of bitter resentment, all traces of fear replaced by anger at being caught. This is bullshit, Thornton muttered, just loud enough for Nadia to hear. 20 years of service and my career gets destroyed because some— Choose your next words very carefully, Gunnery Sergeant, Henderson interrupted, her voice like a scalpel, because whatever you're about to say will be added to the official record and used as evidence of your bias during your court-martial. Thornton clamped his mouth shut, but his eyes when they met Nadia's were filled with undisguised hatred. This wasn't a man who'd learned a lesson about prejudice. This was a man who blamed Nadia for the consequences of his own actions, who would never accept that a black woman could legitimately outrank him, command him, hold authority over him. Nadia held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see that his hatred meant nothing to her. She'd faced down insurgents in Fallujah, Taliban fighters in the Korangal Valley, ISIS operatives in Syrian compounds. A racist Marine with a damaged ego was barely worth her attention. She turned away and climbed into Henderson's SUV. 3 hours later, Nadia sat in Colonel Henderson's office reviewing security footage on a large monitor. Major Sullivan occupied another chair, taking notes. A civilian lawyer from the base legal office, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Morrison, no relation to the detained staff sergeant, had joined them to assess the civil rights implications. The footage was damning, not just from this morning's incident, which showed in excruciating detail how Thornton had escalated a routine security check into an unlawful detention, but from dozens of other incidents over the past 18 months that Thornton had been in charge of gate security. A black Navy lieutenant commander, attempting to access the base in civilian clothes after a deployment, detained for 40 minutes while Thornton verified his credentials despite the officer presenting valid ID. A Hispanic Army captain, driving her teenage daughter onto base for a dependent medical appointment, subjected to a vehicle search and interrogation about suspicious behavior that turned out to be nothing more than speaking Spanish on the phone. A black Marine sergeant returning from leave questioned extensively about whether his dress uniform was authentic because Thornton claimed it didn't fit right. 3 separate incidents of black or Hispanic civilians, contractors with proper authorization, being denied entry entirely, with Thornton claiming their paperwork was suspicious, despite base records showing it was properly filed. The pattern was undeniable. Thornton had been running the gate checkpoint as his personal fiefdom, subjecting people of color to additional scrutiny, delays, and harassment, while white service members and civilians moved through with minimal screening. "How did this go on for so long?" Nadia asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Henderson's expression was grim. "Because people who are detained or harassed don't always file formal complaints. Because some of the victims were junior enlisted who feared retaliation. Because Thornton knew exactly how to walk the line, always claiming security concerns or proper protocols, always creating just enough plausible deniability to avoid triggering an investigation. Until he made the mistake of doing it to someone who outranked his chain of command," Sullivan added. Rebecca Morrison leaned forward. "Colonel Chambers, this footage represents sufficient evidence for a federal civil rights lawsuit under Title 42, U.S. Code Section 1983. You have clear documentation of discrimination based on race and gender, carried out by a federal employee acting under color of law. The government's liability here is substantial." Nadia nodded slowly. "I want to contact the other victims. The lieutenant commander, the army captain, the sergeant, all of them. They deserve to know they weren't imagining the discrimination. They deserve justice, too." "Agreed," Henderson said. "I'll have my staff reach out to each person identified in these incidents. And Colonel Chambers, I want to be very clear about something." She paused, making sure she had Nadia's full attention. "What happened to you this morning was inexcusable. It should never have happened. And it reflects a systemic failure in how we've been operating this base. You were selected for this command position because you're the best person for the job, not despite being a black woman, but because your record of service, your tactical expertise, and your leadership abilities are exceptional. The fact that my gate security couldn't recognize that, couldn't see past their prejudices to acknowledge your authority, tells me we have much deeper cultural problems to address." "Yes, ma'am," Nadia said quietly. "I brought you here to revolutionize how we train special operations forces across service branches. That mission hasn't changed, but I'm adding another mission." Henderson's voice hardened with determination. "You're also going to help me root out this culture of discrimination. Starting with Thornton's court-martial, continuing through a complete overhaul of our security protocols, and extending to mandatory bias training for every Marine on this base. We're going to make Camp Pendleton a model for how the military should operate in the 21st century." Nadia felt something shift in her chest, a transition from the victim of discrimination to the agent of change. This morning's humiliation could become the catalyst for systemic reform. Thornton's prejudice could be transformed into the evidence that forced institutional accountability. "I'm ready to start, Colonel," Nadia said. "Both missions." Henderson smiled, a rare expression that made her look 10 years younger. "I knew you would be. Now let's talk about your first order of business." She pulled out a file folder. "In addition to everything else, you have 73 Marines arriving tomorrow morning for the first phase of Joint Special Operations training. They're coming from force recon units across the Marine Corps, and I'll be honest with you, not all of them are happy about being commanded by an Army officer. Especially a black woman Army officer," Nadia said dryly. "Especially that," Henderson confirmed. "But here's what I know about Delta Force operators. You don't get that far in special operations by being fragile. You got to where you are by being tougher, smarter, and more resilient than everyone around you. So I have complete confidence that you'll win over these Marines the same way you've won over every other skeptic you've encountered in 16 years of service, by being undeniably excellent at your job." Nadia took the file, flipping through the roster of Marines who would be under her command. Names, ranks, service records, specialties. 73 men, not a single woman among them. Most with multiple combat deployments, all with the kind of elite training that came with force recon selection. They would test her. They would question her. Some would resist her authority the same way Thornton had, and she would prove every single one of them wrong. "There's one more thing you should know," Sullivan said, pulling up a different file on his tablet. "The news about your detention has already leaked. Someone at the gate, we're still determining who, posted video on social media before we could stop it. It's going viral. 20,000 views in the first hour, and it's accelerating." Nadia's stomach dropped. Video of her in handcuffs being dragged to a detention cell while Thornton spouted his prejudiced assumptions, available for the entire world to see. Her humiliation, broadcast globally. "Let me see it," she said. Sullivan hesitated, but Henderson nodded permission. He turned the tablet toward Nadia. The video was worse than she'd feared. Shot from the perspective of someone in the backed-up traffic, it captured every moment of the confrontation. Thornton's voice came through clearly. "You people always have such elaborate stories. Probably somebody's girlfriend. You don't belong here." The comments section was exploding. "This is what black service members face every day. She's a lieutenant colonel and they treated her like a criminal. The way he said 'you people,' absolutely disgusting. This Marine should be dishonorably discharged. How many other black officers has he done this to?" There were also predictably defenders of Thornton. He was just doing his job. Security protocols exist for a reason. She should have been in uniform. This is why women don't belong in combat roles. Nadia closed her eyes, breathing through the wave of emotions. Part of her was mortified that her lowest moment was now public entertainment. But another part, the part that had spent 16 years fighting for recognition, fighting to prove herself, fighting against assumptions and barriers and prejudice, recognized an opportunity. If this story reached millions of people, if her experience became part of the national conversation about discrimination in the military, then maybe her humiliation could serve a purpose. Maybe other black service members, other women in uniform, other people who'd faced similar treatment would feel less alone. "Colonel Henderson," Nadia said, opening her eyes, "I'd like to make a public statement about what happened." Henderson studied her carefully. "Are you sure? Once you go on record, there's no taking it back. You'll become the face of this issue." "I've been the face of multiple issues my entire career," Nadia replied. "First black woman in my Delta Force unit. First woman to command certain types of operations. First black officer to receive certain commendations. I'm used to being first and being scrutinized. And if my experience today can shed light on systemic problems, then I have an obligation to speak up." "All right," Henderson said. "We'll coordinate with public affairs to schedule a press conference. But, Colonel Chambers, one word of advice. When you tell this story to the media, to the American public, remember that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every service member who's faced discrimination and been too afraid or too powerless to fight back. Make them proud." Nadia thought about the lieutenant commander detained for 40 minutes. The Army captain searched because she spoke Spanish. The Marine sergeant whose uniform was questioned. All the victims documented in Henderson's security footage, and all the victims who weren't documented, whose stories were never recorded, whose suffering never led to accountability. "I will, ma'am," Nadia promised. "I'll make them all proud." If you believe that those who abuse their authority should face real consequences, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what happens next in Colonel Chambers' story will show you that justice in the military justice system can be swift and unforgiving. 6 weeks later, Colonel Nadia Chambers stood at the head of a military courtroom in her dress uniform, every ribbon and medal precisely placed, her Delta Force unit patch clearly visible on her shoulder. The silver star gleamed on her chest, a reminder of the day in Mosul when she'd led a rescue operation that saved 14 hostages from an ISIS compound, taking shrapnel in the process but refusing to leave until every civilian was evacuated. That uniform told a story: 16 years of service, 3 combat deployments, dozens of classified operations, a record of excellence that should have made her undeniable, unquestionable. But Gunnery Sergeant Derek Thornton had questioned it anyway, had dismissed it, had treated her like a criminal based solely on the color of her skin. Now he sat at the defense table in his own dress uniform, stripped of his weapons qualification badges, his chevrons looking somehow diminished, flanked by 2 military lawyers who'd spent 6 weeks building a defense that was about to crumble under the weight of evidence. The courtroom was packed. Media representatives filled the back rows, cameras positioned to capture every moment. Several of Thornton's other victims sat in the gallery: the Navy lieutenant commander, the Army captain, the Marine sergeant, all prepared to testify about their own experiences. Master Sergeant James Washington, the Force Recon veteran who'd witnessed Nadia's detention, sat in the front row in his dress blues, ready to provide his account. And presiding over it all, Brigadier General Margaret Harrison, the first female Marine general in this district, and a woman who'd built her reputation on zero tolerance for discrimination. "This court-martial is now in session," General Harrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of military law. "The accused, Gunnery Sergeant Derek Thornton, stands charged with multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. How does the accused plead?" Thornton's lawyer stood. "Not guilty on all counts, ma'am." The trial proceeded with military precision. The prosecution, led by Colonel Thomas Blackstone, methodically built their case. Security footage played on large monitors, showing Thornton's interaction with Nadia in excruciating detail. Audio recordings captured every prejudiced assumption, every racial dog whistle, every moment of escalation. "You people always have such elaborate stories," Blackstone repeated, playing the audio for the 3rd time. "Gunnery Sergeant Thornton, can you explain to this court what you meant by 'you people'?" Thornton shifted in his seat. "I meant people trying to access the base with questionable credentials." "Really?" Blackstone pulled up footage from 3 weeks earlier. A white male in civilian clothes, also claiming to be a military officer, also driving a rental car. "Here we see another individual in similar circumstances. Did you detain him?" "No." "Did you question his credentials?" "I scanned his ID and it verified." "Did you scan Colonel Chambers' ID?" A pause. "No." "Why not?" Thornton's jaw clenched. "I believed it was fraudulent." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on my experience." "Based on her race and gender," Blackstone interrupted. "You took one look at a black woman in athletic wear and assumed she couldn't possibly be a high-ranking military officer. Isn't that the truth?" "Objection," Thornton's lawyer called. "Calls for speculation about my client's mental state." "Overruled," General Harrison said. "The witness will answer." Thornton's eyes burned with resentment. "I made a judgment call based on the totality of circumstances." A judgment call that resulted in a decorated combat veteran, a Delta Force operator, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, being handcuffed and held in a detention cell for nearly 30 minutes. Blackstone let that sink in. "How many times in your 5 years running gate security have you detained a white male officer under similar circumstances?" Silence. "I'll answer for you, Gunnery Sergeant. 0, not once. But you've detained, delayed, or harassed 7 people of color in that same time period, all documented in the security footage this court has reviewed. 7 incidents where you subjected Black and Hispanic service members and civilians to additional scrutiny that white individuals did not receive. 7 incidents where you assumed guilt, criminality, or fraudulent behavior based on race. 7 victims, and Colonel Chambers makes 8. The prosecution called witnesses throughout the afternoon. Master Sergeant Washington testified about watching Nadia's detention from his vehicle, about how her repeated attempts to identify herself were dismissed, about how Thornton's language and actions revealed clear racial bias. The Navy lieutenant commander described his own 40-minute detention, the humiliation of being treated as suspicious in his own uniform, the assumptions Thornton made about whether he'd stolen his officer's insignia. The Army captain broke down while recounting how her teenage daughter had cried during their vehicle search, terrified by the armed Marines surrounding their car, traumatized by watching her mother, a decorated officer, being treated like a criminal. By the time Nadia took the stand, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from judicial proceeding to something closer to a reckoning. "Colonel Chambers," Blackstone said gently, "please describe for this court what happened on the morning of September 15th. Nadia took a breath, then spoke clearly and precisely. She described arriving at the gate in civilian clothes, the deliberate choice to assess security protocols without the advantage of rank insignia. She described presenting her military ID, watching Corporal Cooper's confusion turn to suspicion. She described Thornton's escalation, his refusal to verify her credentials through proper channels, his assumptions about her being somebody's girlfriend. He told me, and I quote, "You people always claim to be someone important," Nadia said, her voice steady but her hands gripping the witness stand. "He questioned where I got my degree. He suggested I probably had a criminal record. He physically restrained me, had me handcuffed with excessive force, and held me in a detention cell while refusing to make a single phone call that would have verified my identity in 30 seconds. How did that make you feel?" "Objection," Thornton's lawyer said. "Relevance, Your Honor, the emotional impact of discriminatory treatment is absolutely relevant to understanding the severity of the offense," Blackstone countered. "Overruled. The witness may answer." Nadia looked directly at Thornton for the first time since taking the stand. "It made me feel like 16 years of service meant nothing, like 3 combat deployments meant nothing, like a Silver Star and a Purple Heart meant nothing, because in that moment, Gunnery Sergeant Thornton looked at me and saw only my skin color and my gender, everything I'd accomplished, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd proven. None of it mattered to him. I was just another black woman who didn't belong." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "No further questions," Blackstone said quietly. The defense tried to mount a case, but it was hopeless. They argued that Thornton was following security protocols, but the prosecution showed how those same protocols were selectively enforced. They argued that Nadia's civilian clothes justified additional scrutiny, but footage of white officers in similar situations receiving routine access demolished that claim. They tried to paint Thornton as a dedicated Marine who'd simply made a mistake, but the pattern of 7 previous incidents made that impossible to believe. When the verdict came, it was swift and unanimous. "On all charges," General Harrison announced, "this court finds the accused, Gunnery Sergeant Derek Thornton, guilty." Thornton's face went pale. In the gallery, several of his victims began crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being believed, finally being validated, finally seeing accountability. "Sentencing will be announced after a brief recess," Harrison continued. "This court is adjourned." 90 minutes later, they reconvened. General Harrison looked directly at Thornton as she delivered his sentence. "Gunnery Sergeant Derek Thornton, this court sentences you to reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 2 years, and dishonorable discharge from the United States Marine Corps. Your behavior has disgraced the uniform you wore. You abused your authority, discriminated against service members based on race and gender, and brought shame upon the Marine Corps. You will serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when prejudice is allowed to corrupt military discipline." Thornton's lawyer started to object, but Thornton himself sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. 20 years of service erased. His pension gone. His rank stripped. His freedom forfeit for the next 2 years. The consequences of treating a superior officer like a criminal based on the color of her skin. As the MPs led Thornton from the courtroom, Nadia felt a complex mixture of emotions. Not satisfaction exactly. This wasn't about revenge, but a sense of justice being served, of a system finally working the way it was supposed to work, of accountability replacing impunity. Outside the courthouse, she gave a brief statement to the assembled media. "Today's verdict sends a clear message," Nadia said, cameras flashing as she spoke. "Discrimination in any form is unacceptable in our military. Race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, none of these should determine how service members are treated. We all wear the same uniform. We all take the same oath. We all deserve the same respect." A reporter called out, "Colonel Chambers, do you think this case will lead to broader changes in military culture?" "I hope so," Nadia replied, "but a single court-martial isn't enough. We need systemic reforms, mandatory bias training, accountability mechanisms, leadership that takes discrimination seriously, and a culture where victims feel safe reporting incidents without fear of retaliation. That's the work that starts now." 5 years later, Colonel Nadia Chambers, now promoted to full colonel, stood in the exact spot where she'd been detained that foggy September morning. But everything had changed. The gate checkpoint had been renamed the Chambers Memorial Gate in her honor, with a plaque commemorating the incident and the reforms that followed. Security personnel rotated through mandatory bias training every 6 months. A civilian oversight committee reviewed gate detention incidents quarterly. Anonymous reporting mechanisms allowed service members and civilians to flag discriminatory treatment without fear. And most importantly, the culture had shifted. Not completely, systemic change never happens overnight, but measurably. Documented incidents of racial profiling at Camp Pendleton had dropped by 73%. Other military installations across the country had adopted similar reforms, using Nadia's case as a blueprint for change. The Joint Special Operations Training Initiative that Nadia commanded had become a model program, graduating over 400 Marines and Army operators in integrated special operations tactics. Her training methods were being adopted by other special operations commands. 3 articles she'd authored on cross-service integration had been published in military journals. She'd been invited to speak at the Pentagon, at service academies, at conferences around the world. And standing beside her at the gate that morning, preparing to cut the ribbon on the newly renovated checkpoint, was Master Sergeant James Washington, recently promoted and assigned as her senior enlisted advisor. "You know," Washington said quietly as they waited for the ceremony to begin, "5 years ago, I watched you get handcuffed at this spot and thought the system would protect Thornton. Thought nothing would change. Thought you'd just be another victim." "What changed your mind?" Nadia asked. "You did." Washington smiled. "You could have taken a settlement, transferred to another assignment, let the military bury the incident. Instead, you stayed. You fought. You turned your worst day into something that helped thousands of other service members. That's leadership, ma'am." The ceremony began. Colonel Henderson, now retired but present as an honored guest, gave opening remarks. Several of Thornton's other victims spoke about how the reforms had made them feel safer, more respected, more valued in their service. And Nadia gave the final speech, standing at a podium with the Chambers Memorial Gate sign visible behind her. 5 years ago, I arrived at this gate as an incoming commander and was treated like a criminal, she said, her voice carrying to the assembled crowd of Marines, media representatives, and military leaders. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern of discrimination that had been allowed to flourish because no one with sufficient rank had experienced it directly. My rank gave me the power to demand accountability. But accountability without systemic change is meaningless. She gestured to the renovated checkpoint, to the training facilities visible in the distance, to the diverse group of Marines and soldiers standing at attention. The reforms we've implemented here, the oversight, the training, the cultural shift, these represent what's possible when we refuse to accept discrimination as inevitable, when we demand better from ourselves and from our institutions, when we recognize that diversity isn't just a buzzword but a source of strength that makes our military more effective, more adaptable, more representative of the nation we serve. Nadia paused, looking directly at the cameras broadcasting this ceremony to military installations worldwide. To every service member who's faced discrimination, your experience matters, your voice matters, your dignity matters. Don't accept mistreatment as the price of service. Report it, document it, fight it. The system isn't perfect, but it can work, if we demand that it works. As the ceremony concluded and the ribbon was cut, Nadia thought about Derek Thornton. He'd been released from military prison 8 months ago after serving his full sentence. Now a civilian struggling to find employment with a dishonorable discharge on his record. She'd heard through informal channels that he remained bitter, unrepentant, convinced he was the real victim. Some people never learned, never grew, never recognized their own prejudice. But his inability to change didn't diminish what Nadia had accomplished. The hundreds of service members who'd benefited from the reforms. The culture that was slowly, painfully, incrementally becoming more just. The next generation of officers who would inherit a better system because Nadia had refused to accept the status quo. That night, in her quarters, Nadia recorded a video message that she posted to social media, a platform she'd embraced reluctantly but effectively as a tool for reaching young service members. "What's your view about this story?" she asked the camera. "If you were in my position 5 years ago, handcuffed at that gate, would you have had the courage to fight back? Would you have turned humiliation into reform?" She paused, letting the question resonate. "I'm asking because this work isn't finished. Discrimination still exists in our military. Racism, sexism, homophobia, they're all still present, sometimes blatant, often subtle. We've made progress, but progress isn't the same as victory. We need the next generation of leaders to continue this fight. We need allies who'll speak up when they witness discrimination. We need victims who'll report rather than suffer in silence. We need a military that truly lives up to its stated values." Nadia looked directly into the camera. "So here's my challenge to everyone watching. What will you do? When you witness injustice, will you film it and post it online, or will you intervene? When you see discrimination, will you stay silent, or will you speak up? When you have the power to create change, will you use it?" She smiled slightly. 5 years ago, I was detained at a gate for the crime of being black and female in a position of authority. Today, that gate bears my name. That's not about ego. It's about ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. It's about transforming pain into purpose. Nadia ended the recording and posted it with a simple caption. "Justice is slow, but it's real. Keep fighting." Within hours, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in from active duty service members, veterans, civilians, people sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that one person can create systemic change, here's what I need from you. Hit that subscribe button for more true stories of accountability and justice in the military. Smash the like button if you believe those who abuse authority should face real consequences. Drop a comment below. Would you have had the grace to turn discrimination into reform? Have you ever witnessed someone in power misjudge someone based on appearance? Share this story with someone who needs to hear that fighting back against injustice is worth it. And tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I want to know how far this message of accountability travels. Remember, authority without accountability is tyranny. Rank without responsibility is corruption. Power without justice is oppression. The military taught Colonel Nadia Chambers how to lead, but it was discrimination that taught her how to transform systems, from detained to decorated, from victim to victor, from humiliation to history. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention.